Good morning, everyone. Happy to see again so many people coming from all parts of the country to here, to Beersheba, for the fourth time. I hope you enjoy this session and the entire conference. So it's a great pleasure to invite our first speaker, our keynote speaker, who came from the US, Professor V.S. Subrahmanian. I hope I make it right. Please.
So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bracha. Thank you, Lior. And it's a great pleasure to be back in Israel, and in particular to be back at Ben-Gurion University. So, okay. So I'm going to be talking today in the sort of more or less heartland of cybersecurity in Israel, which means the heartland of innovation and cybersecurity in the world today, on forecasting the spread of malware in a host population, a population of computers. This is a paper that just appeared a couple of months back and is joint work with two of my students, Chan-Hyun Kang, now at AT&T, No-Song Park, Eduardo Serra, who is a former postdoc, and Aditya Prakash, who's at Virginia Tech. So I don't think I need to say much in Beersheba about the fact that the rate at which malware is spreading, or new kinds of malware are being created, is increasing at an astonishing rate. So you can see just huge jumps in just 1 year from 2013 to 2014. And this is from a Symantec report. What we're trying to do in this work is to look at a host population of computers, such as within an organization, within the network of Ben-Gurion University, within the state of Israel, etc., and say, can we predict how many hosts, the expected number of hosts, so when I say expected, I mean a statistical quantity, can I predict the expected number of hosts which will be infected by a very specific piece of malware? So if I'm looking at malware M, and I'm looking at a population of 1,000 hosts in a network, can I predict how many of them will be infected by that malware? And as Professor Kost and Bracha have both eloquently said before me, we want to do this in a data-driven way. So I'll talk about our data in a couple of minutes. But very simply, if you look at the small picture, you have some hosts, A, B, C, D, and E, just a set of examples, a timeline, T1 to T9, and further, of course. And hosts get infected by malware at various points in time. So a host may be infected with a piece of malware well before you know it's on that host. So generally speaking, there's a time at which the host gets infected, and that's shown by the left side of these red bars. And you can see that this host, A, got infected by one piece of malware. In this picture, I'm assuming we're talking about one piece of malware. I don't care which one it is, but for now it's an arbitrary but fixed piece. It's infected at these times. And so if I look at time 7 over here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 hosts that are actually infected. Now, usually, if you're lucky, the time at which the infection occurs and the time at which the detection occurs are the same, and that means you really didn't get infected. If you're unlucky, you got infected, and you found out you were infected after the fact, when your antivirus has released a signature saying, oh, there's something on your machine, which is not good. That's the detection time over here. And so you can see here that at time 8, there are a couple of hosts that have been detected to be infected with this specific piece of malware. The time at which hosts are detected to have malware, the time at which they're infected, etc., depends on many different things, as all of you know. It depends on the virulence of the malware, for sure. It's like all of us. When we are infected by some variant of the flu, it depends on the flu strain that's infecting us, but it also depends on the properties of the host. So if I'm, a 2-year-old kid, which in some ways I wish I was, then I might be more susceptible than if I was, a robust 20, 25-year-old man. Okay? So we know that the ability that infections depend on both the hosts, the properties and the behavior of the host, as well as the virulence of the malware, and we're trying to look at both in this work. So very simply, there's a simple cycle. The virus or malware is detected, it's looked at, and an antivirus company releases a signature for it. At some point after that, they release a patch, which is hopefully supposed to fix the problem and fix the vulnerability that is being exploited by the malware. So I'm going to be looking at data from Symantec's wine database. So for those of you who don't know about wine, Symantec, the cybersecurity firm, has a data set that they make available to academics under various protocols. And it enables us to look at a fair amount of real data. In this picture, what I'm showing you on the x-axis is days and since infection, or since the release of a piece of malware, or since it was first detected anywhere. And on the y-axis, I'm showing two things: the number of infected hosts and the number of detections. This red line is the number of infected hosts. So you can see that on some days we detect more hosts that are infected, on some days there are fewer hosts. I'm sorry, on some days there are more hosts that are infected, on some days there are fewer hosts that are infected. This changes on a daily basis. So today, 2,000 hosts may be infected. Tomorrow, another 400 hosts only may be infected. But what you see here on this blue line at the bottom is a relatively flat picture. And there are two takeaway messages from this. One, there's a big gap between these two figures. That says the number of detections that we saw across the Symantec data that we looked at shows that we are detecting very little compared to the number of infections. Second, the detections don't seem to be going up or down in any substantive manner. They're staying more or less constant. All of which is bad news, right? Okay. So let's go back here. What we're trying to do in this paper is to predict this value here. What is the number of infected hosts in a particular enterprise? And let me skip over this. So how do we go forward on this? We're not using classification because we're trying to predict a number. So we're going to be using various kinds of regression models. But we basically do this through an ensemble. And generally speaking, what I want to say is that I've been working on data science and applied data science in particular in many different disciplines. And generally speaking, I like ensemble models, all right? So if you want a very general machine learning or data mining program that works for lots of applications reasonably well, you've got a number of techniques like SVM for classification, various regression frameworks for regression. But if you want to predict one thing really well, I found that I'm usually best served by some ensemble of approaches. I'm not saying that's a panacea, but we are basically looking at an ensemble consisting of three parts. A feature-based prediction model, where we propose a novel set of features. An epidemic model of spread, which is inspired by the SIR model of disease spread. So for those of you who are familiar with the SIR model, it's been used in epidemiology for about 80, 90 years now. And then we try to combine the two with various regression methods, as well as with some clustering and similarity-based methods. So I'm going to talk about each of the three components, 1, 2, and 3, and then tell you what we got and where we need to be. So let me start with our feature-based method. The kind of data that we store in slightly simplified terms consists of 5 parts. An ID for a host, the ID for a malware, a name of a file that's infected by that malware, the time at which the infection occurred, and the time at which it was detected. Now, I can't reason about malware that I've not detected, okay? So if I don't know it exists, it's hard to sort of say much about it. So obviously, we're missing something. And unfortunately, in the case of malware, as everybody knows, there's a lot we don't know, all right? So I can't claim we know everything either. So we get the telemetry data in this form from Symantec. From this, in the feature-based method, we compute various features associated with hosts. What I'll do is to show you a simple recurrence relation that tries to link the hardness in detecting a piece of malware with the ability of a particular host to detect that malware and use good cyber hygiene methods. And for this, we come up with mathematical definitions. I won't show all the definitions, but I'll talk about detection and patch ability of hosts and link that to the hardness of detecting a piece of malware. After that, I'll talk about aggregating this across countries. Now, in the work that we did with Symantec, the data, the hosts we had country identifiers associated with the hosts. So they wouldn't tell us which specific enterprises these hosts may have belonged to, but they told us this host is from this country. In particular, we didn't have a lot of things that a cybersecurity professional working in the industry would have, like IP addresses, so we did the best we could without that. So we try to compute country-level features from these host-level features by basically aggregating up in relatively simple ways, and then we build our prediction model for feature-based prediction. So let me talk about detection. Okay, my student had prepared these slides originally. And by the way, let me also say that my students did most of the work. So No Song Park and Chan Hyun Kang should get most of the credit if you like the talk. Okay. So again, each host there's a host H, a malware M, a file F, infection time at which the file was infected I, and detection time. And we want to define detection incompetence and patch incompetence. A very crude way to define detection incompetence is simply the delay between the time at which you detected the infection and the time at which it was actually infected. Okay? So that is very simple, and I'll give you more complex definitions in a couple of minutes. And likewise, the patch incompetence says how long after it was infected did it actually get patched. Okay? Very simple. Okay. But I'm going to now talk about slightly more complicated things, and I'm going to talk about what I call the absolute detection ability of a host. So let's think back. If I'm a host, let's take two hosts, H1 and H2. So I've got a host here and a host here. Now, if this host is attacked by a piece of malware, all other things being equal, if this host is attacked by a piece of malware, and this host is being attacked by a piece of malware, and this guy, the same piece, and this guy deflects it, and this guy does not, and this happens over and over again, you would think this guy is better at dealing with malware than this guy. Okay? So in other words, if I want to detect the ability of a host to detect malware, I should look not only at the, and let me sort of just take one more scenario. I've got this host here and this host here. If this host deflects a piece of malware of a certain degree of hardness to detect, and this host does not, the same one, you would say this guy did a better job than this guy, right? So what this means is that the hardness of detecting a piece of malware that's over here should be directly proportional to the ability of a host to detect that malware as well, right? So if two hosts, all things being equal, are doing equally well on n pieces of hardware, n pieces of malware, and on the n+1, the first host deflects it, and the second one does not, you would think that the average detection ability of the first host is better than that of the second, right? So we're trying to capture this via a set of recurrences, and we call the average detection ability of a host. I won't go through the technical definition of this weight term, but the basic idea is that if I know the average detection hardware of a piece of malware M, and I look at all files infected by malware M, detected at time t, associated with host H, so everything that was, every file that was infected by malware M and detected at time t, associated with host H, then if I aggregate this across all pieces of malware M appearing in that particular host via some weighted version, I won't go into the definition of the weights, then I want my ability of the host to detect the detection ability of the host to be proportional to this. I could write this formula down in a few different ways, okay? But really what I'm trying to say is that my ability to detect malware should be proportional to the hardness of the malware that I detect. The hardness, detectability of the malware that I detect. And likewise, conversely, the hardness to detect of a piece of malware should be proportional to the ability of the hosts that actually detect it. Correct? I don't know this value, and I don't know this value, so how do we compute it? So for this, we come up, by the way, after I sent these slides, I found a small bug on this chart. I'll tell you what it is in a minute. So what we do is to define something called a BiFixpoint algorithm, which is, I mean, fixed point algorithms have been around for a long time. And what we're saying is, I need to iteratively compute the hardness of a piece of malware and the detection ability of hosts at the same time, in lockstep, one by one. So we start off by saying, I'm going to initialize the detection ability of a host to some constant value. A convenient value is simply 1 over the number of hosts, saying I'm starting out with the assumption that all hosts have the same detection ability. And all malware pieces have the same difficulty of detection, which is 1 over the number of pieces of malware. You can initialize this in other ways, but this initialization has some good properties that I'll come to in a minute. Then what I do is basically maintain a state. So I have all my pieces of malware laid out in an array, all my hosts laid out in an array, and I fill in this array the absolute detection ability as initialized here in these 2 steps of the host and the detection hardness of the malware. And then I iteratively apply this formula that I gave on the previous slide. I say, take the state associated with malware M and aggregate this formula across all malwares that affect file M and are detected at time t for host H. And find the absolute detection ability of this using the previous state, which is initialized here. Okay? So I'm calling that ADA prime. Okay? And then I'm doing the same thing over here. So this should be a prime here, which is the missing error in the slide. Sorry. So that's the error here. So what happens? I start out with an average detection ability for every host, a detection hardness for every piece of malware. I use that as the current state, and then I update in this loop. And I keep doing this till the array doesn't change a whole lot, either array. Okay? And that's basically what this sentence here is saying. And then I return what I've got. Okay, okay. So, you know, those of you who've looked at PageRank will say, well, PageRank does something similar, and PageRank is one of a family of these fixed point algorithms. Unfortunately, for PageRank, we don't actually have a good convergence proof. Here, the good news is I can prove that this is going to converge. And therefore, that this process of changing these state values is going to eventually terminate, okay? Which is a nice property to have. And in practice, I don't have a guarantee on how many iterations it will take, but in practice, it's terminated within a few iterations, okay? Basically on the order of 10 to 20 iterations, it terminates. In addition, you know, Bracha and her group have done a lot of work on collaborative filtering, okay? So we are using some of that as well. So we add to our feature-based description the notion of similarity between hosts, and a host can be characterized by a vector of properties associated with the host. And we basically look at the similarity between 2 hosts by comparing these 2 vectors. There are a number of measures that can be used to compare 2 vectors. I won't go through the details. What we do is to come up with a probability of a host being infected by malware M considering similarity. So in other words, when I'm looking at a particular host, I look historically at not just that host, but other hosts that have been infected by it that are similar according to the similarity metric, and I derive a probability for it. Again, there are a lot of details, but I'm not going through all of them because I want to give you the basic idea. So I compute the similarity, and then I aggregate it across all hosts in a country to get the similarity of the probability or the expected number of actually hosts in a country infected by malware M. We add to this time-lagged features. So in other words, as we know that malware is spreading at some rate, we also add not just the values of the features I've just talked about, but also lag these values by time, saying this was what this value looked like t units in the past. And that's what's going on here. So very simply, for the feature-based approach, we have features from raw values such as detection incompetence, patch incompetence. We have features from the BiFixpoint algorithm, detection ability and patchability. I didn't talk about detection hardness and patch hardness, but they can be defined by a similar BiFixpoint algorithm as here. And then we have these collaboration features or collaborative features that look at similarity between the malware I'm looking at, the hosts I'm looking at, and other things that have been looked at in the past. And then as we're doing this at the country level, we also look at some country level indicators like the Human Development Index for the country from the UNDP. So using all and time lag everything. And then we basically have a regression which makes predictions of the expected number. It doesn't work very well, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. Okay, so I'll talk about experiments later, and that the whole reason we went to an ensemble-based approach is because this by itself does not work that well. Let me go to the epidemic prediction model next. So for those of you who've studied prediction models in social networks, for instance, or in populations in general, the SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered model, is a very well-known basic model. And here you have, it's used for a lot of things, but basically you have every node in the network is in either a susceptible state, that means it is susceptible to infection by a piece of malware. At some rate B, it gets infected, and then at some rate R, it gets immune. What we did was to adapt this a little bit. We replaced the recovered state by two states, detected and patched. Clearly, in the case of malware, I need to detect the fact that it exists in a host before doing anything about it. And then I need to patch. So what we have is a model that consists of a susceptible state for every vertex, every node in the network, an infected state, a detected state, and a patch state. We're going to move from the susceptible state to the infected state at some rate beta of t. So in other words, you can think of beta of t as the rate at time t that susceptible nodes are actually becoming infected. I don't know that rate yet, and I'll talk about how to estimate that in a minute. What we're trying to do, likewise, from an infected state, I'm going to a detected state that is looking at a detection rate similar to the rate of going from susceptible to infected. There's a detection rate of going from infected to detected. Likewise, there's a patching rate which talks about the number of things patched at time t, given that some malware has been detected. And likewise, from state D, the detected state, I can go back to a susceptible state. So think of it as, I've got a piece of malware on my machine, and another one gets downloaded, okay? Because you've not fixed the problem. So intuitively, I don't know, are people actually able to see any part of this formula from the back? Yeah, okay, well, but you're in the front. Okay, so let me just say very briefly what this is. So what we're trying to do is to come up with a recurrence relation here, st plus 1, that estimates the number of susceptible nodes at time t plus 1, given information about the number of susceptible nodes at time t, the number of infected nodes at time t, the number of detected malware nodes in a detected state at time t, and the number of nodes in a patch state at time t. Okay? Again, every node is in one of these four states, and I'm using s of t to tell me the number of susceptible nodes at time t. Okay? And I'm defining s of t plus 1 in terms of s of t, I of t, d of t, and p of t. Now, very simply, if you look at this picture, the number of susceptible nodes, if you forget all these formulas, the number of susceptible nodes at time t plus 1 is equal to the number of susceptible nodes at time t minus the number that move from the susceptible state to the infected state minus the number that move from the susceptible state to the patch state plus the number that show up in the susceptible state even though an infection has been detected. Okay? That's what this formula tries to capture, and I'll say a little bit more about it in one of the next slides. Okay, so, okay, I'm going to skip this training part. How am I doing on time, by the way? Well, I'll keep going well. Okay. Okay, I'll assume that means an unbounded amount of time. Okay, I was kind of looking for that hard upper bound. Okay, thank you. So, okay, So let's just look at this one formula in more detail, and then you'll get the basic idea of the other formulas, okay? So let's look at this formula ST plus 1. As I said, the intuition for the number of nodes infected at time t plus 1 is the number of, susceptible at time t plus 1 is equal to the number of nodes in the susceptible state at time t minus the number that transitioned from state S to state I, and I'm going to estimate that by this term, I'll come to that in a second, minus the number that went from the susceptible state to the patch state, which I'm estimating by this term, plus the number that went from the detected state back to the susceptible state, okay, which is this term here. So let's just go over this term for a minute. So this term is obvious. S of t plus 1 is S of t minus, let's look. Every susceptible node here, in principle, could be in contact with every infected node here, right? So at time t, I have S of t susceptible nodes, I of t infected nodes. So think about this as, you know, we've got a population of people in this room. I hope nobody has anything. But some of you are susceptible, some of you are infected, and you may randomly come in contact with each other while having coffee, while sitting in the room, etc. Again, please excuse me for using this example, and I hope it's not true, but that's the intuition. So S of t times I of t is the set of all possible pairwise interactions between a susceptible node and an infected node. Beta of t is the transmission rate, or the infection rate going from infected to susceptible. So basically what beta t is trying to capture is a rate which says what is the probability that a random pair of people or hosts, one susceptible, one infected at time t, will cause the infection to spread from the infected node to the... So that's this here. And in the same way, we have similar terms here and here. Of course, I do not know any of these values right now. I don't know beta t, I don't know I of t, I don't know any of these other parameters. Theta of t is the patching rate. At what rate are things patched? Delta of t is the, there are two patching rates, one going from a susceptible to a patch state, one going from a detected to a patch state. So you would expect these two numbers to be different, okay? And basically, that's what this parameter here is, and this parameter here is 1 minus delta t. This is all, 1 minus delta t is the unpatched rate going from detection, okay? So I won't go through the definition of this and this, but that's a general idea, okay? So very quickly, you're going from one state to another. Let me say a little bit about the infection rate, which is beta t. We know by looking at many pieces of malware that infections go up and down, okay? So it's not a straight curve. I showed you one aggregate picture showing how infections spread. In general, I will show you some real examples of specific pieces of malware. And you'll see that the infection rates are not, necessarily obeying a regular behavior, which is the reason for this cosine term here, okay? Again, so we write beta t as a base infection rate, beta 2, plus a function that captures the amplitude of cyclicity in the way things change, okay? And again, I won't go through the details, but effectively, this is nonlinear effects. Okay, and I'll skip this slide. All right. So that's DIPS. It's the formula for estimating S of t plus 1, I of t plus 1, D of t plus 1, and P of t plus 1. What is the number infected, detected, patched, and susceptible at time t plus 1 for any t? One variant of this is what we call DIPS exp or expanded, which allows for the birth of new hosts. Okay, so what can happen is that new hosts can come into a network. Think about your network, periodically new computers are added, new servers are added, new routers are added. So this allows for that birth process, and it manifests itself by a change in the formula for S of t plus 1 over here. Otherwise, it's the same. So it's a slight variant. Okay, so this model also doesn't do very well by itself. And I'm going to say a little bit about our ensemble and then give you some experiments, okay? So, okay, actually I don't like this, not enough training data. So ignore that cover, that title. But what we're doing here is very simple. We've got the semantic database. We extract the features using the feature-based model I talked about earlier, and we come up with predictors using regression on the basis of the features, okay? Again, as I said, I'm not very happy with those predictions by themselves. We use the DIPS model, which does better in many respects, and the DIPS exp model, and we also come up with preliminary predictions. We then add to this clusters by clustering similar groups of malware together and say, can I derive additional features by clustering malware with other similar variations of it? So at the end, what I've got is my ensemble model, ESM, of which I have two flavors, which I'll come to in a minute, which basically takes the features we have in the feature-based model plus the prediction. It takes the dips and dips X features plus their predictions, and it takes the notion of similarity between different pieces of malware into account, and then generates one unified prediction. And this works much better, okay? And we discover similar pieces of malware by looking at similarity in their temporal behavior, okay? Using, I know Robert Moskovich is an expert in temporal behaviors, and we use dynamic time warping to quantify similarity between hosts with various features, which I won't go into. But basically, and the big problem is, I wouldn't say not enough training data, but lots of noise, okay? So what we do then is, how do we estimate all the parameters I talked about, okay? Actually, I forgot to mention this in the, on the SIR model, the epidemic model that I described a minute back. To estimate the parameters, thank you, I think I'm in good shape. To estimate the parameters, what we do is to use our training data and try to come up with a model that estimates the values of theta t, delta t, etc., by doing a least sum squared error calculation, okay? For this, we transform that problem using the training data into a quadratic and nonlinear optimization problem. Actually, it's nonlinear. And use an optimization algorithm called the Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm, which is well known in the literature, to come up with the values of those parameters, okay? Once that is, and that's what generates this prediction here, okay? Now, what we did was we tested with many different kinds of regression here, and looked at the end, what we did was to use Gaussian process regression, which has some nice properties that I won't get into. And let me just say a little bit about our experiments. The data we looked at the 50 most infectious malware that was present in the data set that Symantec allowed us access to. I actually don't know what those pieces of malware are because they didn't tell me. They were all coded with some codes. But those are the 50 most common pieces of malware that we saw. We took the 40 countries which have the highest per capita GDP in the world. And so we got a total of 50 times 40, 2,000 combinations of country malware pairs. And tracking in total about just under 1.5 million hosts across these 40 countries. And just under, it's very annoying to have a number like 2.99 million. You can't quite claim 3, which is what you'd like to claim, but it's close. Records and all. And these are those records which I showed you earlier: host, malware, the file that's infected, infection time, and detection time. And we looked at the feature-based model by itself, dips and dips X by itself. Funnel is an algorithm that was published by a good friend of mine at Carnegie Mellon, Christos Faloutsos, at KDD a couple of years back. And let me say that we used it because we did not see a paper that looked at predicting the number of infected hosts by a specific piece of malware in the literature, okay? So if it's there, we did not find it. And we found the next best thing, which was this paper here, which looked at predicting the number of people in a population who contract a certain disease using historical data from the Centers for Disease Control, okay? And we adapted it. So that's called funnel. So even though I'm going to show that funnel didn't have good performance, it's not entirely fair to them, okay? They were predicting a different thing altogether, and they tuned their model for something different. And so it's not fair for me to compare and say that didn't work well, because maybe if he'd spent a lot of time tuning it, it would have worked better, okay? But some fairly decent due diligence didn't produce what we wanted. Our ensemble basically looked at our feature-based model, dips, X, and similar malware, which is ESM0. And ESM1 took all this into account plus funnel, okay? And we threw funnel into our ensemble. And we measured predictive accuracy by various measures, but nothing which is a huge surprise. mean absolute error, which is the true infections minus the predicted number of infections at a given point in time, root mean squared error, a normalized version of root mean squared error. I never liked root mean squared error by itself because it's an absolute number, and I can't really tell. When I see it, is this good or bad? So I always prefer a normalized version, which is what we have here. And then, of course, good statistical measure, Pearson correlation coefficient, linking the predicted number at time t with the actual number. Let me show you some of the results. And by the way, we're nowhere near, I'm almost done, okay, another 2 minutes. So if I look at funnel by itself and plot the correlation coefficient on the y-axis and the root mean squared error normalized on the x-axis, what you see is this huge clump around 0. What I want is a clump as high as possible here, okay? A low root mean squared error, close to 0, and, excuse me, and a high correlation coefficient. And each of these dots is one of those 2,000 points. I mean, it doesn't look like 2,000 points because many are on top of each other. That's funnel. If I look at the feature-based method alone, it doesn't do well either. It's all over the place. So it's got low root mean square error, but also highly variable correlation coefficients, which is not good. If I look at dips by itself, it's actually much better. It's got quite a lot up here, but also some up here and, a bunch over here. ESM 0 also gives me a bunch here. And what happened to the ESM 1? There should be an ESM 1 slide somewhere. But if I sort of give you the absolute numbers here, what you see is that depending on which measure I use, dips, ESM 1, ESM 0 all do pretty well compared to the competition. So we do much better than just FBP alone, funnel alone, dips, X, dips, these 4 do pretty well. And actually, using funnel doesn't actually give me much. I'll show you a little bit about our system for specific pieces of malware. This looks at the country US, a specific malware ID. And this yellow line shows you when the training data ended and when we were predicting. Now what you see here, so on the left of the yellow is the training. What you see here is the red line, which is what our predictive model does. Funnel, which is the blue line here. And the true, which is the green line, which you see here, okay? I want you to just look at this slide for a minute. Here, what you're seeing is a behavior after the training, which is somewhat different from what we saw before. Training goes up a little bit, goes down, goes up, goes down, goes back up, okay? That's the red line, which is the green line is the truth. Goes up, goes down, goes up again, and then goes down. And our red line, which is our prediction, goes up a little bit, but not for as long, goes down, comes back down, goes back up, and then comes back down, okay? So it's doing pretty well. And you see that in the Pearson correlations we have over here, which is 0.89 between ESM and as compared to funnel, for example, which is this blue line. Funnel, for whatever reason, stays very flat a lot, okay? So we see this trend all the time. Here's another example, US again, another piece of malware. And again, you see a similar pattern. I've got this is going down, and then it flattens off here after a certain number of days. So here, again, you see the green line, which is the ground truth, coming down, getting a little straightened over here, saddle, and then coming back down. Here we see this coming down, flattening out, and then going down again here. So we are off a little bit on time. But again, you can see that funnel is completely flat. Okay? Again, unfair comparison, I want to emphasize. But it was the best we could compare with in the literature. So anyway, I'll stop there. I know that I'm out of time. But I think what this shows is that we've made a lot of progress over the state of the art, but we also have a lot of progress left in front of us. I'd like to conclude with just one brief comment about prediction and classification, which is not what I talked about today. But generally speaking, for classification, we heard Braha talk about it. I look for a trifecta of 3 things. 1, you should have accurate classification. 2, it should be explainable. And 3, it should be actionable. So when we work on things, we try to look for that trifecta of things. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. Okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Question, anyone?
Did you see a lot of variation within a certain country? Could you try and find certain trend within the same country, trying to cluster it internally?
So, very good question. So, right now, what we're doing is looking at the predictive ability for individual countries, as well as the values of the patch ability, detection ability for one country, each of the 40 countries. So I think we are seeing as you saw in the ESM picture that I showed, there's a good number out in that top left-hand corner, which is where I want it to be. But there's some spread towards the bottom right, as you go towards the bottom and to the right. And in a sense, I show that picture because if I give you an average value, you would get high correlation coefficients, when in fact, you're seeing a broader spread than I would like to see, okay? A broader error than I would like to see, yeah. Again, this is sort of the problem in pretty much all predictive models, right? People cherry pick the one predictive measure that makes them look good, okay? And what I'm trying to tell you is that, there's a good, bad, and ugly, So according to some measures, I think we generally beat existing work quite fairly on all measures, but there's considerable room for improvement, yeah. And certainly we're seeing variations by malware and by country. So there are some malwares where we don't do well. We're doing a fairly good job at capturing, the ups and downs, but we're getting it wrong on time, for instance. So, yeah.
At the first graph, you showed that the number of detections is much lower than the number of infections. But I don't understand, how do you know that the host is infected if you didn't detect it?
It's the time. So I know afterwards that it was infected at this point in time. So I am detecting it, but the first graph, maybe I can go back to this picture.
Yes.
So these are the numbers detected on that day, okay? But I know after the fact that there were this many that were infected at that time. I don't know if that's answering
so
your
the
question.
lower graph is only if you detected
on day D.
In the same time.
Yeah. So this tells me, for example, that on day 100, I detected this many.
Okay.
But on that day, I know after the fact that this many were infected, because I detected them at some later point. Let me say this again, okay? So once an antivirus signature is released for a particular piece of malware, let's say it's released today.
Okay.
I can go back and look at the files. My antivirus is looking at the files on my machine when it receives this new signature, and it says, and that's why Wine actually records every single file that is on the system from when. So it goes back and says, okay, this file with this malware was introduced into the host 40 days earlier, okay? And that's how I know 40 days later that it was infected on day now minus 40. So, yeah. Sorry. I do want to emphasize one more thing. In this data, as I said, I don't know if I emphasized this. In this data, I had no network information, okay? So I had no information on which host was physically connected to which other host. I just knew that all these hosts were in the same country. If I had that network information, I could probably build a more robust model with greater accuracy, okay? But I was actually talking to some system administrators at University of Maryland, and they said, well, gee, crap, we don't know what our network looks like either, okay? Which is a scary thought, but it seems more prevalent than I'd like to hear, so.
Okay, actually, I also have a question for you, but we don't have time for it, so I will ask you later. And let's thank again our keynote speaker.